March 1, 1957, Southern California. The temperature at Lyons drag strip in Long Beach was cool, low 60s, the kind of morning that made engine oil sluggish and tires hard. The sky was flat, overcast, the color of wet concrete. And somewhere in the staging lanes, a driver named Emery Cook was about to do something that would haunt American drag racing for the next 6 years. Engine number 10 on this list. He wasn't famous yet. He was just a man behind the wheel of a nitromethane burning dragster, about to make a run that nobody in that staging lane was prepared for. And when he hit the throttle, the car didn't just go fast. It went past what anyone standing trackside believed a quarter-mile of asphalt could produce, 166 miles an hour. In 1957, on a track built for cars running half that speed, with guardrails made of wood and spectators standing close enough to feel the heat off the headers, the crowd didn't cheer. They went quiet. Not impressed quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when a few hundred people simultaneously realize they just watched something they weren't ready to watch. Track officials looked at that run and they didn't know what to do with it. Nitromethane wasn't against the rules. Nobody had built a rule against it because nobody had imagined an engine could do that with it. They found nothing illegal on that car. So, 4 days later, a group of California strip operators sat down in a room and banned the fuel anyway. Not because Cook cheated, because he hadn't, and that was the terrifying part. And here's what should genuinely disturb you. That ban, the one that reshaped drag racing for 6 straight years, wasn't even the strangest chapter in NHRA's long, uneasy relationship with the engines that scared its own officials. There were engines built from 2 motors bolted together. Engines that spun turbine blades instead of pistons. Engines that used compressed air instead of metal to keep their valves from melting. Every one of them got the same treatment as Cook's nitro burner. Investigated, found technically legal, and banned or restricted anyway because the sports rulebook could not keep up with what desperate, brilliant men kept building in their garages. Stay with me. Because in the next few minutes, I'm going to take you inside 10 of the most dangerous engine programs NHRA ever allowed onto a starting line, and the 10 decisions that followed them. I'm going to show you the exact mechanical reasoning behind each one, the horsepower numbers, the failure rates, the specific moments officials realized they'd let something out of the barn they couldn't put back. Not vague legends about crazy old racers. The actual engineering, the actual dates, the actual rule changes written in direct response to specific engines. And I am going to make you a promise right now. By the time this video ends, you will understand exactly why the National Hot Rod Association, an organization built entirely around the idea of making cars go fast, spent 70 years writing rule after rule specifically to slow its own competitors down. And the most uncomfortable part of that promise is this: every single time they did it, they were right to be afraid. Let's start at the beginning, because the beginning is where NHRA learned the lesson it would spend the rest of its history relearning, that a rule written to describe what an engine cannot do only works until someone reads it and finds what it doesn't say. Engine number 9 on this list. In the earliest years of organized drag racing, the rule book was thin. Officials wrote it assuming one engine, one car, one set of pistons doing what pistons had always done. Everyone read that rule and saw a single-engine dragster. A handful of racers read the same rule and saw something else entirely. Nothing in it said a chassis couldn't carry 2 engines instead of 1. Nothing said the power couldn't come from 4 wheels driven independently by 4 separate motors. The rule had a wall. It just didn't have a ceiling. Think about it, the way you'd think about doubling the air pressure behind a closed valve. One engine pushing against the resistance of a quarter-mile of asphalt and a fixed set of tires is one kind of force. 2 engines pushing through the same narrow channel of traction is not twice the force. It's force fighting itself, torque steer multiplying with every foot of travel. A car trying to tear itself in 2 directions at once even as it goes forward. Racers like Norbert Lock built dragsters running twin flathead engines coupled together. engines that individually made modest power but combined into something that overwhelmed the chassis engineering of the era. Tommy Evo went further and built an exhibition dragster powered by 4 separate Buick engines, one driving each wheel. A machine so violent under acceleration that its own builder described the steering as barely controllable, the car fighting the driver's hands the entire length of the track. It smoked all 4 tires from the starting line to the finish, a spectacle that drew enormous crowds and terrified the men standing along the guardrails. The results were undeniable. Multi-engine cars posted numbers gasoline-burning single-engine dragsters of the era couldn't touch, and during NHRA's own nitro ban years, these twin and quad-engine machines became the sport's biggest draw, specifically because they filled the horsepower vacuum nitro had left behind. But officials watching from the tower saw something they couldn't unsee: a fundamentally unstable machine. 4 engines worth of torque routed through steering geometry designed for a car that was one bad coupling away from disintegrating at speed in front of a grandstand full of families. There was no single technical violation to point to. The engines were legal. The chassis passed inspection. NHRA banned multi-engine dragsters from competition anyway, folding the restriction into the same 1957 rules package that killed nitromethane, because the organization had learned that not technically illegal and not dangerous were 2 entirely different questions. But you need to understand something about that era before we go further, because the multi-engine ban wasn't an ending. It was the first data point in a pattern that would repeat for the next 7 decades. Every time NHRA closed one door, the most stubborn engineers in the sport went looking for the door nobody had thought to lock. If you think that's the last time this sport let something onto the track it had no idea how to stop, you are about to be very wrong. Engine number 8. Which brings us to the strangest chapter in this entire story. The years when a handful of racers looked past pistons entirely and asked a question nobody else in drag racing had seriously asked: what if the engine didn't reciprocate at all? What if, instead of pistons slamming up and down thousands of times a minute, you simply spun a turbine, the same basic principle powering military jets, and pointed the exhaust straight down a quarter-mile of asphalt? The rulebook of the era said almost nothing about turbine propulsion, because nobody who wrote it had imagined a drag car built around one. That's the loophole in its purest form. Not a clever reading of an existing sentence, but a category of machine the sentence writers never conceived of. A handful of builders experimented with jet and turbine-assisted dragsters through the 1960s, chasing a fundamentally different kind of power delivery. Instead of a horsepower curve that built through gear changes, a turbine produced a flat, continuous, almost unnerving wall of thrust, the kind of acceleration a piston engine physically cannot replicate, because it isn't limited by reciprocating mass slamming to a stop and reversing direction thousands of times a second. The performance numbers were staggering for the era. Turbine-powered exhibition cars posting elapsed times competitive with the best nitro dragsters, despite running fuel and combustion principles that had nothing in common with a conventional engine. But the danger profile was just as extreme. A turbine failure doesn't sound like a piston engine letting go. It doesn't throw a rod through the block. A turbine failure can release the stored rotational energy of blades spinning at tens of thousands of RPM in a fraction of a second, and, unlike a reciprocating engine's explosion, that energy doesn't necessarily stay contained inside a bell housing built to catch it. NHRA officials, watching cars that operated on principles completely outside their existing safety and containment standards, made the call that these machines belonged in exhibition runs only, official record books, national event competition, all closed to turbine and jet propulsion, not because a turbine broke a written rule, but because the entire safety architecture of the sport had been built around containing a different kind of failure than the one a turbine represented. The Wynn's turbine cars posted in exhibition settings stayed real. The door to using that power inside actual NHRA eliminations closed and has never reopened. We've come now to the 7th engine on this list, And I want you to pay particular attention to this one, because this is where NHRA stopped banning entire categories of engine and started going after something far more specific: the tiny internal components that let an engine survive abuse it was never designed to survive. Engine number 7. By the 1960s, alcohol and fuel classes were routinely spinning engines to RPM ranges that pushed conventional steel valve springs past their fatigue limits. A steel spring compressed and released thousands of times a minute doesn't fail gracefully. It fatigues, develops microscopic cracks, and eventually snaps. And when a valve spring lets go at 9,000 RPM, the valve it was controlling can drop straight into the path of the moving piston, an event that destroys an engine from the inside in a fraction of a second, and, in the worst cases, sends debris through the block wall. Racers reading the existing rulebook noticed it said nothing about the material or mechanism used to close a valve, only that a valve had to close. Aircraft-derived pneumatic valve spring systems, using compressed nitrogen instead of a coiled steel spring, effectively eliminated the fatigue problem altogether. Formula-style racing engines running similar systems were already turning 20,000 RPM for extended periods without spring failure, a number conventional steel springs simply could not survive. The mechanism worked because nitrogen gas, unlike a steel spring, doesn't fatigue from repeated compression the way metal does. It simply compresses and releases the same way every single cycle, indefinitely. For a class already spending enormous money chasing RPM, pneumatic valves promised to remove one of the most catastrophic and expensive failure points in the entire engine. The result should have been an immediate, sport-wide adoption. Instead, NHRA looked at the cost structure this technology created: a spring failure arms race where the wealthiest teams could simply out-engineer everyone else's reliability, and banned pneumatic valve springs outright across every class in the sanctioning body. Not because the technology was unsafe, because officials determined it would concentrate competitive advantage entirely in the hands of whoever could afford the most exotic components, turning a driving competition into a checkbook competition. The rule still stands today, decades later, one of the rare instances where NHRA banned a genuine safety improvement specifically to protect competitive parity rather than protect against physical danger. Now I need to pause here and tell you something that makes this entire era genuinely different from anything that came before or after it. Engine number 6 isn't about a component NHRA banned. It's about raw, uncontained power that officials allowed to run for decades before finally admitting they'd let it go too far. Supercharged nitromethane engines through the 1960s and 70s made their horsepower by forcing enormous volumes of air and fuel into the combustion chamber under pressure, and every increase in boost meant an increase in the violence available when something inside that engine failed. And things failed constantly. A blower explosion, a supercharger case rupturing under internal pressure when a rotor seizes or a piston lets go beneath it, doesn't stay contained the way a normal engine failure does. It sends the entire top half of the supercharger housing, along with burning nitromethane, upward and outward in a fireball, directly in front of the driver's face, at speeds where a fraction of a second of reaction time is the difference between a minor incident and a career-ending injury. Throughout the 60s and 70s, supercharger explosions became one of the sport's most visually terrifying and physically dangerous recurring events. Captured on film again and again, blower parts landing in grandstands, drivers walking away from fireballs that should have killed them. For years, NHRA's response was essentially nothing beyond driver safety equipment: better fire suits, better harnesses, better roll cages. The supercharger itself remained an open, unrestrained component sitting directly in front of the driver's chest, held on by nothing but its mounting studs. It took until 1982, a full 2 decades into the supercharged nitro era, for NHRA to mandate supercharger restraint systems on top fuel dragsters, steel straps and containment devices specifically engineered to keep a failed blower's components from launching into the cockpit or the crowd. The rule arrived only after enough explosions had proven, repeatedly and violently, that an unrestrained supercharger sitting inches from a driver's head was a design flaw the sport had simply tolerated because nobody had written a rule requiring otherwise. The requirement later extended to funny cars as well, and decades after that, further blower blanket and containment technology was mandated across nitro classes, following a fresh wave of engine explosions in the 2010s. The same lesson, learned twice, 40 years apart. And if you think a 2-decade delay before fixing a fireball problem is bad, wait until you hear how this sport handled the fuel itself. Engine number 5 happened recently enough that some of the people watching this video remember it happening live. By the early 2000s, top fuel and funny car engines were running nitromethane concentrations pushed to their practical ceiling, and the horsepower those engines produced had climbed to a point where the internal components, connecting rods, blocks, cylinder heads, were failing in increasingly violent and increasingly frequent ways. The rulebook of that era capped displacement and fuel type, but it placed no hard percentage limit on the nitromethane blend itself, because for decades the assumption had simply been that teams would burn whatever concentration their engines could physically survive. Engineers reading that silence in the rulebook kept pushing the blend higher, and higher concentrations kept producing more catastrophic failures until 2004, when a fatal accident involving top fuel driver Darrell Russell at a national event forced NHRA to confront a question it had avoided for 50 years. What happens when an engine survives right up until the exact moment it doesn't? NHRA's response was immediate and severe. Officials temporarily reduced the maximum nitromethane concentration to roughly 85%, down from the near unrestricted blends teams had been running. Think of it, the way you'd think about turning down the pressure on a valve that's already cracked. A small percentage reduction doesn't sound dramatic, but nitromethane's power curve is not linear. A few percentage points of concentration translate directly into combustion pressure spikes that either stay inside an engine's design tolerances or don't. Teams reported almost immediately that the lower blend created its own crisis. Engine components that had spent years being engineered specifically around 90+% nitrochemistry began failing in new and unpredictable ways at the reduced concentration, because the entire internal architecture of a modern top fuel engine, piston design, ignition timing, fuel delivery, had been built around one exact chemical target, and moving that target broke the assumptions everything else was built on. By 2008, after years of mechanical chaos of the lower blend, NHRA returned the limit to 90%, where it remains today, a rare instance of a safety rule getting rolled back, not because the danger had gone away, but because the cure had created a different, equally unpredictable kind of danger. Engine number 4 isn't about the engine's internal chemistry at all. It's about what happens when an engine simply gets too good at doing the one job it was built to do. Through the 1990s and into the 2000s, top fuel dragsters kept getting faster, and one of the primary levers teams used to extract more terminal speed was the rear-end gear ratio, lower numerically, meaning the engine could keep pulling harder for longer before running out of mechanical advantage. Nothing in the rulebook of that era placed a hard floor on how low that ratio could go, because nobody writing the rules had anticipated cars approaching 30 miles an hour in a quarter mile, a speed regime where tire technology, chassis aerodynamics, and parachute deployment systems were all being asked to do things they were never originally engineered for. Teams experimenting with gear ratios as low as 2.90 kept extracting more terminal velocity out of engines that were, on paper, obeying every displacement and fuel rule in the book. The results were staggering runs, records broken almost every season, and a growing unease in the NHRA tower about where exactly this was heading. The mechanism here wasn't a loophole in engineering, it was a loophole in imagination. Every gear ratio reduction brought a measurable increase in top-end speed, compounding across an entire season of experimentation. Officials watching insurance costs and catastrophic parts Failures climb in direct proportion to those speeds eventually formed a dedicated Performance Limitations Task Force to study the problem. The conclusion was blunt. Top fuel dragsters were approaching speeds the sport's own safety infrastructure had not been designed to survive a failure at. NHRA mandated a hard 3.20 rear gear ratio limit across top fuel competition, one of the only rules in the entire book written not around what an engine does internally, but around the simple, blunt physics of how fast is too fast for the sport itself to safely contain. Now stick with me, because the next two engines on this list are the ones most casual fans have never even heard of, and the reason you haven't heard of them is exactly why they belong here. Engine number 3. Long before rear-engine dragsters became the standard you see at every NHRA national event today, top fuel cars ran their engines up front, inches from the driver's knees, with nothing but a thin steel bell housing separating the driver's legs from a spinning clutch assembly under enormous load. Nothing in the rulebook of that era required anything stronger, because for years nobody had proven it needed to be stronger. Racers reading the rulebook saw a sport built entirely around raw horsepower, and horsepower kept climbing every single season, while the clutch and bell housing technology holding that power together barely changed at all. The math caught up with the sport on March 8, 1970 at Lyons Drag Strip, when a legend of the sport, Big Daddy Don Garlits, staged his front-engine dragster for a routine qualifying run. The transmission let go at full throttle. The explosion tore the car in half directly beneath the driver's seat, and Garlits lost part of his right foot in the accident. He survived. And when he came back, he didn't come back in a front-engine car. He built the first successful rear-engine top-fuel dragster, moving the entire engine and clutch assembly behind the driver instead of in front, so that the next time a bell housing let go, it would explode away from the human being in the car instead of directly beneath him. Here's the mechanism that matters. Nobody made rear-engine dragsters mandatory. NHRA never wrote a single sentence banning front-engine cars. The sport didn't need to. Within 2 years of Garlitz's accident, virtually every serious top fuel team in the country had voluntarily abandoned the front-engine layout because the math was undeniable. Moving the most violent failure point in the entire car, 90 degrees away from the driver's body, was simply safer, full stop, and any team still running front-engine after 1972 was competing with one hand tied behind its back on both speed and survivability. NHRA followed the industry's own migration with mandatory scatter shield and bell housing containment rules that still govern the sport today. The front-engine, top-fuel dragster didn't get banned. It got made obsolete by its own body count, and that is arguably more damning than any rule NHRA ever wrote. But here's the part of this story that should really unsettle you, because the next engine on this list didn't just threaten the driver's legs, it put the fire directly in the driver's lap. Engine number 2. By the mid-1960s, the flip-top funny car had become the sport's most explosive new attraction. A full fiberglass body hinged to lift up and off a modified dragster chassis with a supercharged nitro-burning engine mounted just ahead of the driver, sealed inside what was essentially a fiberglass shell with almost no ventilation. Nothing in the era's rulebook required a firewall of any real substance between that engine and the driver's compartment, because funny cars were new enough that the rulebook was still catching up to what the class had actually become. When a blower exploded or a fuel line ruptured inside that sealed body, burning nitromethane had nowhere to go but backward, directly into the cockpit, and drivers were being pulled from cars with severe burns with alarming regularity through the late 1960s and into the 1970s. The mechanism is simple physics. Nitromethane burns extremely hot and extremely fast, and inside an enclosed fiberglass shell with poor airflow, a fuel fire doesn't vent outward the way an open dragster engine fire does. It fills the available space, and the available space included the driver. Officials investigating fire after fire found the same pattern every time. no illegal fuel, no illegal engine modification, just a body design that had outpaced the safety systems built to protect the person inside it. NHRA's response arrived in stages through the 1970s. Mandatory firewalls, onboard fire suppression, and fire-resistant suits as standard equipment across every nitro class, the direct ancestors of what every funny car driver wears and carries today. Now stay with me for this next one, because it is the strangest entry on this entire list. The only engine here that never lost a single fight it was ever in. Engine number 1. The final one on this list. And unlike every other engine in this story, banned outright, restricted, or forced into containment, this one was never banned at all. This is the one the entire sport eventually adopted as its foundation, and it's the reason every dominant top fuel and funny car engine on Earth today traces its architecture back to a single 1960s design decision. By the mid-1960s, drag racing's power classes had settled almost entirely around one family of engine block, the Chrysler-derived Hemi. Read the rulebook of that era and you'd find nothing that technically excluded other manufacturers' big block engines from competing at the same level. Nothing said a Ford or a Chevrolet couldn't theoretically make comparable horsepower under the same fuel and displacement rules. But the Hemi's cylinder head design, hemispherical combustion chambers allowing larger valves, straighter airflow, and more even flame propagation under nitromethane's violent combustion characteristics, gave it a structural advantage no wedgehead competitor could fully overcome, no matter how much money or engineering was thrown at the problem. Teams running other blocks watched horsepower numbers climb further and further out of reach, and one by one, nearly every serious top fuel and funny car program in the country abandoned their own manufacturer loyalty and switched to Hemi-based combinations. This is the mechanism that matters here. Unlike a rule loophole exploited by one clever team, the Hemi's advantage came from geometry itself, an 8 to 12% combustion efficiency edge baked into the physical shape of the chamber, not from anything written or unwritten in NHRA's book. Officials had no basis to ban it, restrict it, or even meaningfully regulate it beyond the same displacement and fuel limits every engine already followed. And because nobody could out-engineer a shape advantage that fundamental, the entire sport simply converged on it voluntarily. Today, virtually every top fuel dragster and nitro funny car on Earth runs a Hemi architecture engine, most of them aftermarket blocks built specifically for drag racing rather than anything that ever sat in a production car. A design lineage now roughly 60 years old, still undefeated, still the one engine story in this entire list that ends not in a ban, but in total, permanent domination. Here's what I want you to sit with after this video ends. 10 engines. Twin and quad-engine dragsters that fought their own steering to make record power. Turbine cars that replaced pistons with jet age, thrust nobody's rulebook had a category for. Pneumatic valve systems borrowed from aircraft that eliminated a catastrophic failure point and got banned anyway to protect competitive fairness. Unrestrained superchargers that exploded in front of drivers' faces for 2 decades before anyone required a strap to hold them down. A nitromethane blend pushed so high, then pulled back, then pushed back again. A gear ratio limit written for no other reason than the sport running out of ways to safely stop what it had built. A front engine layout that Don Garlitz himself made obsolete with his own body. A flip-top, funny car fire problem that rewrote what has to sit between an engine and a driver's chest. And one hemispherical cylinder head that never broke a single rule and still ended up rewriting the entire sport around itself. Look at that list again and notice what's missing. Not one of these 10 stories involves a team caught cheating in the way you'd normally picture it. No hidden switches, no illegal fuel additive smuggled past a technical inspector, no forged parts. Every single one of these engines passed inspection. Every single one of them was, at the moment it ran, entirely within the letter of whatever rulebook existed that season. The danger was never that these builders broke the rules. The danger was that the rules hadn't caught up to what was mechanically possible yet, and NHRA was left making safety decisions in real time after the fact, often only after something had already gone wrong in front of a grandstand full of people. None of these stories required unlimited budgets on their own. None of them started with a factory engineering department. Nearly every one of them began with a small team, a welding torch, and a rulebook read more literally than the people who wrote it ever intended. So ask yourself, how many of NHRA's rules today exist not because someone broke the sport, but because someone read it too carefully? What does a modern rulebook actually say, word for word, about the engines being built in garages right now? And what does physics allow that this year's rule writers haven't thought to prevent yet? The men behind these 10 engines were not, for the most part, the richest or best-funded builders in their era. What separated them was a specific kind of intellectual stubbornness, an absolute refusal to accept the word impossible or the word banned as a final answer without first checking exactly what the rulebook said and exactly what the laws of combustion and rotational physics actually permitted. Most of the time, the rules had more gaps than anyone realized. There's a line attributed to Wally Parks, the man who built NHRA into what it became, something to the effect that the sport's job was never to slow down human ingenuity, only to keep it from killing the people standing near it. Whether he phrased it exactly that way is disputed. The sentiment, judging by 70 years of rule changes written in direct response to exactly the 10 engines in this documentary, was unmistakably his. His point was never that rules don't matter. His point, whether he said it in those words or not, was that every single rule in that book exists because someone, at some point, pushed past a boundary everyone else had quietly agreed not to touch. That's not a story unique to drag racing. It's the story of every closed door in every field human beings have ever tried to master. Somebody reads the sign that says, "It can't be done," and reads it as a challenge instead of an instruction.